Two video formats entered the ring, Betamax and VHS. One had superior quality, the other a longer runtime and a more open distribution model. So why did VHS dominate living rooms around the world? It wasn't just price or picture. It was content, a very specific kind. This is the true story of how a taboo industry quietly picked a winner and changed home entertainment forever. In the late 1970s, something revolutionary started happening in living rooms across America. For the first time, people didn't have to go to the theater to watch a movie. They could bring the movie home. It was the dawn of the home video era. Two technologies led the charge: Sony's Betamax and JVC's VHS. These bulky tape machines promised a new kind of freedom. You could record TV shows, pause movies, even build a personal library. But there was a catch. They weren't compatible. In the same way you couldn't play a Sega game on a Nintendo, you couldn't pop a Betamax tape into a VHS player, and vice versa. The stage was set for a format war that would decide the future of home entertainment. Sony was first out of the gate with Betamax in 1975. It was a sleek, compact format with clearly superior video quality. The picture was sharper. The sound was cleaner. It felt like a premium experience. Sony poured millions into marketing it as the high-end choice for serious viewers, but with quality came limitations. Betamax tapes could only record about 1 hour of content at launch. That meant most movies or TV shows didn't fit without swapping tapes midway, and the machines weren't cheap. Sony was betting that consumers would pay more for a better picture, but in the world of home video, convenience was about to prove just as important as quality. Just 1 year later, JVC introduced VHS, the video home system. It didn't match Betamax in quality, but it had two killer advantages. First, recording time. VHS tapes could hold up to 2 hours of video, enough for a full movie without interruption. So JVC took a radically different approach to distribution. Instead of locking down the format, they licensed it out freely. That meant anyone, Panasonic, Sharp, RCA, could make VHS machines. Suddenly, VHS players were everywhere. They weren't as pretty, but they were cheap, plentiful, and easy to use. And in the battle for market share, that mattered more than looking good on paper. Sony made a critical mistake. They kept Betamax proprietary. Only Sony could make Betamax machines, and they tightly controlled the tapes too. Meanwhile, JVC opened the floodgates. They let competitors manufacture VHS hardware and media, turning the format into an industry standard almost overnight. VHS was no longer just a product, it was an ecosystem. With every new manufacturer that jumped on board, VHS gained more shelf space, more attention, and more sales. Sony was trying to win a closed war. JVC had built an open one. And in business, open networks almost always scale faster. By the late 70s, consumers were stuck in the middle of a format battlefield. Two machines, two types of tapes, and no easy way to know which would last. Retailers didn't know what to stock. Video rental stores, a brand new concept at the time, had to make a bet. Which format would their customers want? For a while, they carried both, but that meant double the inventory, double the shelf space, and double the headaches. People buying home video systems were paralyzed by choice. What if you spent hundreds of dollars on Betamax and it died out next year? The tech might have been new, but the old problem was clear. Nobody wants to back the wrong horse. In the early phase of the format war, Betamax had the upper hand. Sony was a trusted name with a strong reputation for high-quality electronics. Early adopters gravitated toward Betamax because it felt premium. The picture quality was noticeably sharper, and the build of Sony machines screamed reliability. Retailers leaned toward stocking Betamax, and critics gave it glowing reviews. For a brief moment, it looked like the battle was already won, but beneath the surface, cracks were forming. Consumers weren't just looking for quality, they wanted flexibility, and that's where Betamax began to stumble. One of the biggest complaints about Betamax was its limited recording time. At launch, Betamax tapes could hold just over an hour of footage. That was a deal breaker for anyone wanting to record a movie or a full-length TV show. VHS, by contrast, could record up to 2 hours from day one, and later, even more. That single technical difference changed buying behavior. Consumers didn't want to switch tapes halfway through a film. They wanted convenience. VHS wasn't just a cheaper alternative, it was more practical. The choice between formats was no longer about image quality. It was about what fit into everyday life. While tech giants fought over specs and shelf space, an unlikely player entered the scene: the adult film industry. In the post-theater era, adult studios were looking for a new way to distribute their content. Home video was the perfect solution: private, direct, and repeatable. But they needed a format that supported longer films and didn't come with licensing headaches or corporate restrictions. Betamax was too short and too tightly controlled. VHS, with its longer runtime and open access, was a natural fit. The adult industry didn't make headlines, but it began quietly shaping the outcome of the format war. By the late 1970s, adult films had moved beyond shady theaters. The release of Deep Throat in 1972 sparked a new era of so-called porno chic. Adult films were gaining mainstream attention, but as the theater trend faded, adult studios needed a new outlet. Home video was it. It offered privacy, anonymity, and convenience. No ticket counter, no awkward stares, just a VHS machine and a tape. It was a game changer. Sales of adult content on VHS soared, and the industry quickly realized it had a powerful new distribution model. And in choosing VHS, they weren't just distributing films, they were picking a side. Adult films weren't just part of home video's growth, they were one of its first and biggest engines. People weren't just buying tapes for entertainment, they were building private collections, rewatching scenes, and driving repeat sales. The rental model exploded. In some stores, adult titles made up as much as 40 to 50% of revenue. These tapes weren't advertised on TV, but they moved off shelves faster than blockbusters. Studios producing adult content were among the first to profit from the VHS boom. And their preference for VHS wasn't random. It was a deliberate choice that gave the format a massive early lead, one that Sony couldn't match. As home video gained popularity, adult studios faced a serious problem. Betamax, for all its quality, wasn't practical. The short runtime meant that most full-length adult films had to be split across 2 tapes or edited down. Worse, Sony was very restrictive with licensing. They didn't want their brand associated with explicit content and made it clear that working with adult distributors was off the table. That made production more complicated and expensive. For an industry operating largely in legal gray areas, these constraints weren't just annoying, they were business killers. Studios needed a format that worked with them, not against them. VHS, meanwhile, was a dream come true. The tapes were cheaper to produce and easier to copy. Recording time was longer, which meant fewer edits and more complete releases. And most importantly, JVC's open licensing model meant that any manufacturer could produce VHS players and tapes. There were no moral gatekeepers, no corporate roadblocks. That freedom allowed adult studios to scale production quickly. They didn't have to ask permission. They just hit record and ship tapes. For an industry built on fast turnaround and high volume, VHS wasn't just a good option. It was the only option that made sense. Sony, for its part, drew a clear moral line. The company didn't want to be associated with adult content in any way. In fact, Sony executives made public statements distancing themselves from that part of the industry. It was a principled stand, but it came at a cost. By refusing to work with adult distributors, Sony cut off a growing segment of the home video market. While Betamax tried to keep its image clean, VHS became the default for an entire industry, and not just any industry, one with tens of millions of loyal customers who bought tapes, rented them, and drove up player sales. Sony had taken the high road, but they were losing the war. By 1982, the numbers told a clear story. VHS was outselling Betamax in nearly every major category, and adult content was a key reason why. Adult titles on VHS moved fast, in some cases faster than mainstream films. Stores reported stronger demand, higher rental turnover, and more repeat customers. Studios producing on VHS saw profits rise. The industry had effectively chosen a side, and that decision was reshaping the market. VHS wasn't winning on quality or prestige. It was winning because it gave people what they wanted when they wanted it, and once the money started flowing, everyone took notice. Video rental stores were the front lines of the format war, and when it came to adult content, VHS was where the action was. Retailers noticed that adult VHS tapes, rented out more frequently, were returned more quickly and often got damaged from overuse. A sign of just how popular they were, many stores started giving more shelf space to VHS simply because it made them more money. Some even dropped Betamax entirely. It was a business decision, pure and simple. VHS kept the cash registers ringing, and when retailers picked a side, the rest of the market followed. VHS wasn't just a format anymore. It was the foundation of an entire rental economy. By the mid-1980s, the battle was largely over. VHS had momentum, and it wasn't just because of adult films anymore. Once people started buying VHS players to access a wider range of titles, studios took notice. With more content available, romantic comedies, thrillers, even documentaries, VHS became the de facto standard. It wasn't the better format technically, but it was where the movies were. The catalog won. People didn't care about resolution or color accuracy. They cared about watching what they wanted when they wanted. VHS gave them that. What started with one genre turned into a full-blown consumer shift. Hollywood isn't sentimental, it's pragmatic. By the early 80s, the major film studios saw the trend lines. Betamax was losing ground fast, while VHS titles flew off rental shelves. So they followed the money. More and more films were released directly to VHS, often months before their Betamax counterparts, or not on Betamax at all. Some studios, like Warner Brothers, made exclusive distribution deals with VHS manufacturers. It became a volume game. And once the studios aligned with VHS, it was effectively game over. The adult industry may have cracked open the door, but Hollywood kicked it wide open. In tech media, the story was much cleaner. VHS won because it was cheaper, they said, or because it had longer runtime, or because of better marketing. And yes, those factors mattered. But few mainstream outlets acknowledged the adult industry's role in VHS's rise. It was uncomfortable, taboo, easier to credit market dynamics than a genre many people didn't want to admit they watched. The real story stayed under the surface, whispered, but rarely printed. But behind closed doors, insiders knew exactly what had happened, and so did the retailers counting their cash. Among executives, distributors, and rental store owners, it wasn't much of a secret. Everyone in the business knew that adult content had been the early driver of VHS adoption. It was the proof of concept that got players into homes. It was the reason some stores stayed afloat. It was the spark that forced Hollywood's hand. But publicly, that connection was downplayed. No studio wanted to admit their billion-dollar ecosystem had been built on a taboo foundation. It was one of those open secrets. Acknowledged with a nod, denied with a smile, but the numbers didn't lie, and neither did the outcome. Sony didn't go down without a fight. They made improvements to Betamax, longer recording times, cheaper hardware, and even opened licensing years too late. But the momentum had shifted. By the time most people heard the term format war, it was already over. In 1988, Sony finally stopped producing Betamax recorders in North America. The standard that once seemed unbeatable had been quietly retired. And while Betamax lived on in niche professional settings, in the consumer market, it was dead. VHS wasn't just the winner, it became the symbol of an entire era of home entertainment, thanks in no small part to an unlikely ally. By the late 1980s, VHS wasn't just ahead, it had won. Nearly every home with a VCR had chosen VHS. Rental stores phased out Betamax entirely. Manufacturers doubled down on VHS hardware. Even international markets like Europe and parts of Asia followed suit. For over a decade, VHS was the global standard for home entertainment. And it wasn't because it was better, it was because it was where the content was, from Hollywood blockbusters to cult classics and, yes, adult films. VHS had the volume, variety, and accessibility. It became synonymous with movie night, rewinding tapes, and those iconic clamshell cases. Betamax faded into trivia. VHS became pop culture. Here's the twist. Years later, Sony would own the very thing it once rejected. In the 2000s, Sony Pictures Entertainment was distributing films across all genres, including adult content through subsidiaries and digital platforms. The company that had once drawn a hard line in the sand had quietly stepped over it, following the same demand it once resisted. The move wasn't a public reversal, just a quiet evolution. Business is business, and in a world of streaming, category lines got blurrier. For Sony, it was a full circle moment. The format war was history, but its echoes lingered in corporate decisions long after the tape stopped spinning. The VHS story isn't just about formats, it's about values versus incentives. Sony tried to take a moral stand, JVC didn't. The adult industry needed distribution and VHS provided it. The rest followed. This wasn't some secret cabal behind closed doors, it was market dynamics, plain and simple. What people wanted to watch and how easily they could access it mattered more than what the executives thought was appropriate. The success of VHS showed that being open to demand, even taboo demand, could shape entire industries. It was a collision between ethics and economics won. This wasn't just a format war. It was the first glimpse of something bigger, media fragmentation. For decades, content had been controlled by a few gatekeepers, but VHS broke that. Suddenly, anyone could make a tape, distribute it, and reach viewers. The adult industry was just the first to realize it. What mattered wasn't how polished the format was, it was how quickly and cheaply you could get content to people. This idea that the medium bends to the message, not the other way around, set the stage for everything that came after. Cable TV, DVDs, the internet, it all started with a tape. If this story sounds familiar, it should. The pattern repeated itself when the internet arrived. Again, adult content pushed early adoption of a new medium. Again, tech purists resisted, but users didn't care. Napster, YouTube, OnlyFans, platforms driven by user choice, not legacy standards. VHS taught us that content defines platforms, not specs or spec sheets. The people choose the winners, not the engineers. And in both the VHS and internet eras, the adult industry wasn't an outlier. It was a signal of what people really want, what they'll pay for, and what technologies they'll take into their homes first. Ask people why VHS beat Betamax, and most will say it was cheaper, or that it held more recording time. Maybe they'll mention that Blockbuster carried more VHS tapes. All technically true, but they rarely mention the real accelerator, adult content. It wasn't broadcast in ads. It wasn't talked about in news interviews, but it quietly flooded the market. Millions of people bought VHS players because they could rent or own tapes they couldn't find in theaters. It was a form of freedom, wrapped in plastic cases. And for the first time, technology wasn't chosen in a boardroom. It was chosen in living rooms, one fuzzy tape at a time. VHS's victory is a classic case of a market moving under the radar. The adult industry was never part of official tech debates, press releases, or strategy papers, but it was massive. In the 1980s, it generated billions of dollars annually, often in cash, often off the books. And when it needed a distribution method, it didn't wait for permission. It picked the format that let it move faster. VHS wasn't just good enough. It was easy to copy, easy to sell, and didn't ask questions. That was enough. This is a reminder to every company today: don't underestimate what people are doing when no one's watching, and it might be the future. In business, the cleanest markets are rarely the most profitable. The adult industry backed VHS not just because of tape length, but because the format welcomed them. VHS distributors didn't put up walls, they just sold blank tapes and said, go ahead. That openness created loyalty. And where there's loyalty, there's scale. Some of the earliest repeat buyers of VHS weren't families. They were collectors. Retailers noticed. They shifted shelves. That shift drove adoption. So here's the paradox. The audience many considered too risky ended up being the one that defined the winning platform. Not in theory, in dollars. The Betamax versus VHS story didn't end in the 80s. We saw it again in the 2000s. HD DVD versus Blu-ray. Guess who helped tip the balance? Adult studios chose Blu-ray. Years later, we saw it again with streaming. I chose platforms that allowed edgier or more user-generated content, like YouTube and later OnlyFans, exploded. When tech giants draw the lines, unofficial content often redraws them. Why? Because people want choice, and they'll go where it's given. VHS wasn't just a tech win, it was a cultural one, and the pattern keeps repeating. The platform that welcomes everyone usually wins. It's hard to think of another industry that shaped tech history so profoundly, yet got so little credit. The adult entertainment industry didn't get awards for its impact on VHS. It didn't headline tech expos or appear in investor decks. But in terms of pure influence, it outpaced entire marketing departments. The irony? Most companies pretend it had nothing to do with their success. But that silence says a lot. This was a moment where something considered taboo shaped what ended up in every home. Not with a press release, but with distribution, demand, and dollars. Sometimes the loudest forces are the ones we pretend not to hear. VHS didn't win because it was the best. It won because it was available, flexible, and open to all content. Behind closed doors, a marginalized industry made a market move that outplayed tech giants. The biggest changes in business often come from the places no one wants to talk about. The winner, not just VHS, but a new era where content ruled over quality. So next time you pop in a VHS or scroll past an old tape, remember, it wasn't just a tech choice. It was a cultural fork in the road where a quiet, controversial industry shaped what the world watched. If this story surprised you or brought back memories, hit like, subscribe, and share your thoughts below. Do you think Sony made the right call sticking to its values, or was it a billion-dollar mistake? And more broadly, do you believe content always wins over quality? If you're into strange but true business stories, don't miss our last episode where Michael Jackson outbid Paul McCartney to own the Beatles catalog. Friends turned rivals and pop became power. Tap here to watch.